So today I will be discussing the podcast by This American Life called The Problem We All Live With. These two podcasts are each about an hour long, and they discuss the concept of integration in schools as a solution to the achievement gap. So in the first podcast, it talks about closing the gap between black and white students. Jones speaks about how, regardless of their plans to improve schools, with the majority of black students, it never really works. Even though they have the same ideas as the white schools and sometimes even have the same funding, it's never as efficient. And the only thing she found that truly closes the gap is integration. And this is actually the same type of integration we saw during Brown versus the Board of Education and Ruby, who was the first black student at a white school. She faced a lot of hate and will be very surprised and maybe not so surprised that hate still exists within our country even all these years later. But after the integration during Brown versus Board of Education, we found a significant decrease in the achievement gap, which is what Jones is studying. So integration is really the only thing that we have found that closes that gap. It really does benefit minority students because they're able to gain the best equipment, schools, and facilities. Even though they might sometimes actually have the same equipment and funding, they don't always receive those excellent teachers that the rich schools do receive. And I've actually experienced this firsthand myself. But additionally, it gives the classroom more variety in achievement level. So Jones comments that if you're surrounded by a bunch of kids who are all behind, you stay behind. And integration is a very exciting opportunity for students and families within poor districts. Unfortunately, this podcast does illuminate the resistance towards integration from white parents. Whereas the second podcast focuses on integrations of schools within Connecticut. So Connecticut passed new legislation which creates an opportunity for every family to choose integrated schools. This legislation passed in 2003 after a 14-year battle, and it focuses on the idea that desegregation will only work if it is completely voluntary. After the integration legislation passed, many specialized private schools began to pop up. And these schools threaten integration as they are marketed to rich white families. And without the rich white families, integration is just impossible. So in the first podcast, I was extremely excited to hear about the topic of integration. And despite the efforts of best schools, poor students are more likely to perform with less mastery than white students. I found it interesting that after more than 3 years of schooling to be a teacher, I had never even heard of integration as a solution to the achievement gap. As Jones points out, we just don't talk about it. However, it is very clear from the Normandy school district and its non-accreditation that integration is what black students and parents want for their kids. Unfortunately, the parents of the new school acted with bias towards the new students coming from Normandy, and although they insisted it was not about race, parents were afraid for their children's safety, even though Normandy was not punished due to violence at school. So on one hand, it was extremely surprising to see the ignorance to their own racism from the. On the other hand, the thought processes are what have brought us to the dire education crisis we are currently in. On the other hand, the second podcast highlighted an eagerness towards integration from both sides. Students from both schools embraced each other's culture. The students from both sides benefited by seeing how each other's socioeconomic classes live. As Kiana tells other high school seniors when they ask for advice on colleges, she tells them, quote, "It's better if you experience something different because you get a view of other people." And that's the end of the quote. As somebody who has been within my same culture since elementary school, and I'm now currently moving to a new culture, I completely agree that moving helps you develop more as an individual. Exposure to new cultures, people, and places helps us learn and become more well-rounded. I think this information affects children and educational students because integration has the biggest impact on the students. From one side, students from poorer schools are able to benefit from high-achieving students and expectations, better teachers, and more sophisticated equipment. On the other hand, richer students benefit from learning new cultures and backgrounds, and they really get to appreciate what they have and see what a gift the things they have are. Unfortunately, the cultural acceptance of integration is typically negative from rich white parents and sometimes just the entire family. However, I find that it is extremely important to continue to talk about this. The more we talk about integration and expose its benefits, the more likely we are to close the achievement gap and help students learn about new cultures. As an elementary school teacher, this information is vital to consider. Even just in the classroom, it is important for teachers to create diverse, small learning groups. Students should be exposed to peers from different cultures, backgrounds, and achievement levels. For example, I know that many teachers like to create the blue, red, yellow group to allow for differentiation of teaching based on achievement level. However, I think that teachers should use this grouping carefully to avoid lumping exclusively low students with other low students. Although it can be helpful, it should be used with caution. The traditional aspect of education and its improvement focuses on resources. For example, I was student teaching at a minority majority low income school. At this school, they were throwing money at teachers, they were throwing money at electronics, and they were constantly getting new equipment for the students. Unfortunately, these students had been behind grade level for so long that these new laptops, these new calculators, they weren't going to fix the problem. Teachers were still extremely poor quality, and students were only exposed to other struggling students. I believe this idea of integration goes beyond the traditional aspects of education because it calls for a cultural change rather than just a financial change.